In this video, we're going to learn about population ecology. As a reminder, a population is defined as a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same area. Why it's important to learn about population ecology? Well, it's important to learn what factors in a population changes the way populations grow and what factors stop them from growing, and it is a very important field in biology. So what are some factors that population ecologists measure in order to gain a better understanding of how populations are doing? So within a particular habitat, a population can be characterized by the size, which is usually shown by capital N, which is the total number of individuals within that population that live in a particular area. Populations are also characterized in terms of their density, the number of individuals that live in a specific area. Populations can also be characterized based on their dispersion or distribution pattern, meaning how are they distributed in the area, and different types of populations may have different distribution patterns depending on how they interact with each other and with the environment. So there are three different ways in nature that scientists have found species distribute themselves when they are in a population. They could be either uniform, where there is a uniform distance between the members of the population, and penguins tend to do that. The distribution could be random, so there is no rhyme or reason with respect to the way members of the population distribute themselves, and then also clumped. So why are these the reasons behind these distribution patterns? Usually when the distribution is uniform, there is this carving of a territory property within the population, such that each person gets a person in the population gets a specific space and territory for themselves. With random, usually you see them with plants, because some of these plants, their seeds are distributed based on wind. So there's really no rhyme or reason for where they're going to grow, and they're also not territorial, so it's quite random. Clumped happens in populations where the organisms depend on each other for their survival. So elephants tend to carry and accumulate in clumps, zebras, because of a way of allowing themselves to camouflage themselves based on their striping so that they don't get eaten. So there are various different reasons for how species distribute themselves. So another thing that population ecologists measure is population dynamics. What does that mean? That means they measure how population size changes over time, and also they study what factors affect how a population changes in size. So what are some of the tools that are used to look at population dynamics? One of the ways that is done by looking at demography tools, which is a measure of population dynamics over time. Some of the tools are life tables, survivorship curves, and age structure of the population, which I'm going to describe in the next few slides. So life table is a tool that is used to predict life expectancy of members of a population. So this table is a life table of Dall mountain sheep, but you can form this if you study organisms. You can form this for any organism, including human beings. So how are life tables produced? The population is divided into intervals in terms of their age. So in here, this is done for the first two intervals that you see for the sheep is for 6 months, and then It's done for in 1 year intervals. So the question to be asked is, what are the number of members of the population that die per 1,000? So this quantitation is usually done per 1,000 born. So how many of the 1,000 that are born end up dying in between the 0 and within the first 6 months? And then from that, mortality rate is calculated. And the way you calculate mortality rate is by measuring the number of individuals that are dying, dividing by the number of individuals that are surviving, multiplied by 1,000. So that's why here we have in this interval 54 individuals died within the first 6 months, 1,000 are born, and then the mortality rate would be 54. If you plug in the numbers, you see 54. Another thing, when you do this for all these intervals and you get the numbers, then you get an idea about the life expectancy, or the mean lifetime remaining to those who survive in this area. So usually for Dall mountain sheep, it's about 7 years, and you can see as you increase the interval of age, the mortality rate goes up and life expectancy goes down. So this gives scientists an idea about how the life expectancy of, in this particular Dall mountain sheep. But this type of tables also are used in human populations, specifically for the insurance companies. So when you buy a life insurance, what life insurance companies do, they are in the business of risk. That's how they make money. They kind of bet on a risk not happening to you. So they take into consideration your life expectancy as a human being. And if you've ever looked into it, the older you get, the more expensive life insurance is going to be, because your life expectancy goes down. You are more expected to die as you get older. Another tool that scientists use is age structure. And age structure, again, divides the population into various different ages. And this shows the total population in terms of a graphic. So this graph, another thing that is done when building an age structure is dividing the population into male and female. Now these examples that I'm showing you here, it's assumed that there is a 50-50 ratio. There's as many males and there are females. And depending on how the size of the population changes, the shape of this age structure changes. So a population that is expected to experience rapid growth has a lot of young individuals in the 0 to 15, in this example, 0 to 15 years of age. And then there's not a lot of people make it to the higher ages. So what does this mean? It means that that this population is expected to undergo rapid growth? Because most of the population are in an age range that is predicted to grow up into a childbearing ability to bear new children. And when you have in your population, a large proportion of your population who have a potential to bear children in the next few generations, this makes the population to be predicted to experience growth. Then if you can imagine, if you can imagine that, let's say all of these graphs refer to, let's say, 100,000 people, then when you go look at the stage 2, which is a population that experiencing slow growth, when you look at the 100,000 people in that population, you can see that the proportion of people at different ages it kind of starts to change. Now, in this case, you no longer have a population where a vast majority of individuals are at a younger age. You get some middle-aged people, you get some older people. So therefore, that's why this is predicted to experience slow growth, because the proportion of people in the population who are expected to bear children in the next few generations does not overwhelm the other parts of the population. Then you get to a stage where we say the population seems to form a stable number, because then again you see that the proportion of people in the younger ages is kind of evening out with people in the older ages. So this population is said to be experiencing stable growth. The last one is kind of an age structure that is reminiscent of what's happening, let's say, in Japan, some Mediterranean countries where there's a large aging population and there's not enough of the younger generation. So people aren't having as many babies as they used to before, and the population is starting to age. So that's usually a concern. So depending on the age distribution of individuals in a population, the population can experience either rapid growth, slow growth, stable, and probably a population decline if they don't reproduce as much. Now, there are situations where a scientist would want to compare the survivorship of or life expectancy of different organisms with each other. And since each different organism has a different lifespan in terms of years, it's difficult to compare them side to side. So what is done then, scientists look at number of individuals that are surviving against percentage of maximum life expectancy. So on the x-axis, you're not looking at the absolute life expectancy, it's the percentage of individuals that are alive within their lifetime expectancy. And when you create a survivorship curve like that, then you can see different patterns occurring depending on the type of organism, type of populations that you look at. So for the top, for organisms like human beings and maybe elephants and things like that, usually the percentage of maximum life expectancy is pretty stable. A lot of the population in the beginning parts of their life expectancy are pretty stable. Most of them survive, and then at the old age they die. And this is reminiscent and usually characteristic of organisms that have few children, and then that they take care of their young. So their young survives. Then on the opposite end of the scale, we have this tree, this example of a tree which produces a lot of young. Most of them don't survive, but then some of them survive, and then they survive for a very long time until those who survive for a very long time until to get to their 100% life expectancy. So this is usually characteristic of organisms that produce a lot of offspring, and a lot of that early stage offspring perish. Then in the middle, you get individuals whose percentage of maximum life expectancy sort of goes down in a uniform manner. So you don't have either a lot of them surviving in the early stage or a lot of them surviving in the late stage. So these are the different types of survivorship curves that scientists have found. So now the question is, what kind of factors limit population growth. And there can be two sets of classes of factors that can limit a population growth. And they're either density dependent or density independent. So what does that mean by density independent? That means these limiting factors become more of a problem when the population is more dense. There is more people living in the same area at the same time. And the ones that limit population growth that are density independent, doesn't really matter how many people live in the same area at the same time. So let's take a look at what some of these are. Availability of resources is an example of a limitation that is density dependent. Now, we're looking at growth curves under two different conditions. And the growth curve shows size, population size, which is the number of people in the population over time. Now, if there are no limiting conditions, if all organisms have just enough resources and food and space that they want, that they can grow, if everything is available to the end of time, if there are no limiting if there's no limitation to resources that they need to survive, they keep growing and growing and growing and growing, and the growth is exponential. This is called a J-shaped curve, and it's characteristic of an exponential growth. However, in reality, we are living on a planet in which resources are limited. So what is more close to reality is that the population starts building up and undergoes an exponential phase in the beginning. So up to right about here, it kind of looks like a J-shaped curve. But then as the number of people in the population increases, resources and space become limited. And sometimes there are other factors that are involved. And then the population levels off at a particular size, and this is called the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is a characteristic of that area in which a population lives. So you can think two different islands, one that is small and the other one that is really big. You can imagine that the smaller island has a smaller carrying capacity for organisms that live there, and the one island that is bigger, there's many resources, so the carrying capacity is higher. So this type of growth curve is called a logistic curve. It kind of looks like an S-shaped curve. So this is a comparison of the exponential growth and the logistic growth on the same graph. So in the absence of limiting factors, you can see exponential growth. When limiting factors are there, then this population starts leveling off. Here are a couple of examples of the logistic growth that you saw in the previous slide. The top part is a culture of yeast cells grown in a test tube. So in the beginning, the yeast cells start growing quite rapidly, exponentially, but then as their numbers add up and also as the nutrients in the test tube starts running out, then the yeast cells stop dividing and basically they settle down to a constant number, the maximum they can grow. So this is the carrying capacity for the test tube. On the bottom is a natural population of seals. They're living in an island, and the growth of this population was followed over many years, 1975 to 2000. And as you can see, at first, when the seals populated this particular area, they started growing quite rapidly, but eventually, by the time the late 20th century arrived, then the growth leveled off and kind of remained relatively the same. So one consequence of having too much density is the survival of the young. So This is another example of a density-dependent growth regulation. If you compare two populations of wild donkeys, one, which is shown with the red line, has a high-density population, and the other one shown with the blue line is a lower density population. And you can see if you look at the number of young that die, which is represented by mortality rate, in a population of donkeys where population density is already high, quite a large number of the young donkeys die because of malnutrition in their parents. But in a lower density population, the number of young that die is much lower. So what are other examples of density-dependent limiting factors? One is competition. This is competition in this case, for light. So when there is competition for things that allow organisms to survive, then some of them kind of compete out the others. So there's an example with plants. Then diseases, especially infectious diseases. This is a kind of an artist rendition of the coronavirus that we're dealing right now. Infectious diseases are an example of density dependent limiting factors, because the more dense a population is, the easier the disease can spread and reduce the number of people in the population. That's basically the reason behind the social isolation measures that we are taking to protect people from getting the infectious disease. Then it's predation, and predation, interestingly, can sometimes regulate the population density, population size of both the prey and predators. So if you look at here, there's thousands of animals on the y-axis, and as time goes by in years, the red is shown the population of hare, which is the prey, and lynx, which is the predator. So if you look at here, earlier during, let's say, close to 1845, the lynx population is high, and it's eating the rabbits and then the hare, and then but since they eat all their prey, then there's not enough food left for everybody, so many of them die, basically crashes. But as the population of lynx goes down, then that's an opportunity for the population of hare to rebuild itself. So it goes up again, and as more prey population, as more prey organisms are around, then it becomes easier for the lynx to target them and eat them. And then therefore, an increase in the population of hare leads to an increase in population of lynx, which prey on the hare and then bring down their numbers, and therefore the cycle continues. This is called a boom and bust cycle. Waste accumulation is another density-dependent factor that limits the growth of a population. The more trash and waste is accumulated, the more diseases come, the more toxicity is available, which causes death. Some density-dependent factors can cause behavioral changes. So this is lemmings. They're called lemmings. When the density of their population increases, they pick up and go somewhere else. And sometimes when these lemmings want to go somewhere else, they have to cross a body of water, and many of them die. And this is has given the myth that lemmings like to commit suicide, but actually it's a behavioral response to density-dependent factors. The resources are so limited that the animals want to pick up and go somewhere else where they can find resources. So not all limiting factors are density dependent. There are density independent limiting factors, which means those factors change the population, the level of people in the population, regardless of how dense the population is. And these are natural phenomena like fire, earthquakes, tsunamis, things of that nature. So there are a few questions that we have here for you, which you can attempt.